The girl had not spoken in 7 months. She sat in the corner of Widow Morrison's boarding house like a shadow that had forgotten how to move. Her dress, once blue as summer sky, had faded to the color of old bruises. Her hands rested in her lap, small and still as dead sparrows. The other children gave her wide spaces when they played, as if silence might be catching. Widow Morrison called her Maya, though no one knew if that was her real name. The child had arrived on a wagon full of the dead, the only survivor of something too terrible for decent folks to speak about in daylight. Sheriff Coleman had brought her here with blood still dark under her fingernails and eyes that looked through everything like windows in an empty house. "She ain't right in the head, Mrs." Daniels would whisper over her sewing circle. "Seen too much. Some things break a person clean through. Devils touched her." Old Pete Garrison would mutter into his whiskey. "Mark my words, that child's cursed." But Maya heard none of their talk, or if she did, she gave no sign. She moved through the boarding house like smoke, eating when food was put before her, sleeping when darkness fell, existing in a place between living and dying that had no name. The morning Thomas Gray walked through Morrison's front door, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. He was a big man, tall and lean as a fence post, with shoulders that had carried too many burdens and hands that knew every kind of work the frontier demanded. His clothes were clean but worn thin, patched in places where prairie thorns had torn through. His boots were good leather, scuffed white by alkali dust and hard travel. But it was his eyes that made people step back, pale blue as winter sky, holding depths that spoke of losses counted in silence. "I need help," he said to Widow Morrison, his voice rough as sandpaper. "Got a ranch 30 miles north. Cattle to tend, chickens, a milk cow. Work for someone willing." Widow Morrison looked him up and down, taking measure. She was a practical woman who had buried 2 husbands and raised 6 children to adulthood. She knew the weight of desperation when she saw it. "What kind of help?" she asked. "Someone who can work hard. Don't matter if they're big or small, long as they got heart for it. I got boys here, strong backs." "No." Thomas shook his head. "Boys run off. Boys get ideas about better places. I need someone who'll stay." His eyes moved across the common room, taking in the mismatched furniture, the faded wallpaper, the children gathered around the breakfast table. They lingered on Maya in her corner, and something shifted in his expression. "What about her?" he asked quietly. Widow Morrison followed his gaze, and her face went tight. "Oh no, Mr. Gray. Not that one. She don't speak. Been here 7 months and never said a word. Something happened to her family, something bad. She ain't fit for work." "What happened?" "Raiders. Burned out her homestead, killed everyone. She was hiding in the root cellar when the sheriff found her 3 days later. Been like that ever since." Morrison lowered her voice. "Some say she's touched in the head. Others think she's cursed. Either way, she ain't no use to anyone." Thomas walked closer to Maya's corner. She didn't look up when his shadow fell across her, didn't flinch when his boots stopped just 3 feet away. He crouched down slow, the way a man might approach a wounded animal. "Hello there," he said softly. Maya's hands tightened in her lap, but she kept her eyes fixed on the floor. Thomas waited, patient as stone. Finally, she lifted her head just enough to look at him through the dark curtain of her hair. Her eyes were brown as creek water, shot through with gold that caught the morning light. They were old eyes in a young face, eyes that had seen the world burn and remembered every flame. But underneath the hurt, underneath the fear, Thomas saw something else. A flicker, a ember that hadn't quite died. "You remind me of someone," he said quietly. "Had a daughter once. About your age. Same eyes." Maya blinked, the first movement she'd made since he'd entered the room. "She died," Thomas continued, his voice steady as bedrock. "Fever took her 2 winters back. Her mother, too. Left me with nothing but empty rooms and too much quiet." He stood up slow, never taking his eyes off her face. "I got a place north of here. It ain't much, but it's honest work. Good food, warm bed, no one to bother you if you don't want bothering. Could use someone to help with the animals. They don't need words, just gentle hands." Widow Morrison stepped forward, alarm written across her features. Mr. Gray, I don't think you understand. The child is damaged. She don't work, don't help, don't do nothing but sit in that corner. You be taking on a burden. Maybe, Thomas said, still looking at Maya. Or maybe she just needs someone to see her different. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small red apple, polished bright. He sat on the floor beside Maya's chair and stepped back. I'll be at the general store getting supplies, he told Widow Morrison. If she wants to come, she can. If not, I'll find help elsewhere. The room fell quiet after he left, except for the tick of the mantel clock and the soft scrape of chairs as the other children finished their breakfast. Maya stared at the apple for a long time, her fingers working restlessly in her lap. Widow Morrison bustled about, muttering under her breath about foolish men and their notions. But she kept glancing at Maya, watching. The apple sat there like a small red promise, bright against the worn floorboards. Maya had not touched food with her own hands since the day the sheriff brought her here. Everything had been placed before her, cut for her, prepared by other people's hands. But this apple, this was different. This was a choice. Slowly, so slowly that the movement seemed like prayer, Maya reached out and touched the smooth red skin. Her fingers traced its curve, feeling the firmness, the life still sleeping inside. She lifted it to her nose and breathed in the sweet scent of orchards she remembered from before the world caught fire. When Thomas Gray returned an hour later, dust on his boots and supplies loaded in his wagon, Maya was standing by the door. The apple was in her hands, uneaten but held like something precious. She had wrapped her few belongings in a thin blanket, a spare dress, a pair of worn shoes, a small wooden horse that someone had carved for her during the long nights when fever dreams made her cry out in her sleep. You sure about this, child? Widow Morrison asked, her voice gentler than usual. Maya looked at Thomas, those brown eyes, searching his face for something she couldn't name. He nodded once, a promise in the gesture. Wagon's ready, he said simply. As they walked toward the door together, Widow Morrison called out, Mr. Gray? That child's been through hell. You be good to her. Thomas paused in the doorway, Maya a small shadow beside him. Ma'am, he said quietly, sometimes the only way out of hell is to have someone willing to walk back in and bring you home. The morning sun painted the world gold as they climbed into the wagon. Maya sat beside Thomas on the wooden seat, the apple still clutched in her hands, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the prairie rolled away endless and clean. For the first time in 7 months, she was moving towards something instead of away from it. As the wagon wheels began to turn, carrying them north toward whatever waited in the silence between them, neither Thomas nor Maya spoke. But in that quiet space, something had already begun to heal, two broken souls recognizing the fractures in each other, and finding in that recognition the first small seed of hope. The Gray Ranch stretched across the prairie like a promise someone had forgotten to keep. Thomas's wagon rolled up the long dirt road, just as the sun reached its highest point, painting everything in shades of dust and disappointment. The house sat squat and weathered, its paint peeled away by too many hard winters. Fence posts leaned at broken angles, held up more by habit than strength. In the distance, a handful of cattle dotted the brown grass like scattered prayers. Maya sat beside Thomas on the wagon seat, still clutching her red apple. She had not eaten it during the 3-hour journey, but she had not let it go either. Her eyes took in everything, the sagging barn, the empty chicken coop with its door hanging loose, the well with its bucket sitting dry in the dirt. It ain't much to look at, Thomas said quietly, following her gaze. But it's honest ground. My father built this place with his own hands, back when the grass grew green and the cattle were fat. He climbed down from the wagon and held up his hands to help Maya down. She hesitated, then placed her small palms against his and let him lift her to the ground. Her feet touched the earth of her new home with the lightness of someone still not sure she belonged anywhere. The house inside was clean, but empty of warmth. The rooms echoed with the footsteps of people who no longer walked there. In the kitchen, dishes sat washed and stacked, waiting for meals that would feed more than one lonely man. A woman's apron still hung on a peg by the stove, faded blue gingham that matched nothing and everything. This was Sarah's room, Thomas said, opening a door to a small bedroom with yellow curtains and a bed covered in a quilt sewn with tiny flowers. My daughter's. She'd be about your age now if... He stopped, cleared his throat. You can stay here if you want. Or there's a cot in the main room if you'd rather. Maya stepped into the room and touched the quilt with one finger. The fabric was soft, worn smooth by a child's sleep. She looked at Thomas and nodded once. Good, he said. I'll let you get settled. There's work to do before dark. He left her alone with the ghosts of yellow curtains and the scent of dried lavender tucked between the pillows. Maya sat on the edge of the bed and finally took a small bite of her apple. The sweetness filled her mouth like a memory of better days. The work began that first afternoon. Thomas showed her how to scatter corn for the chickens, though only 3 scraggly hens remained from what had once been a flock of 20. He led her to the barn where Bess, an old milk cow with gentle eyes, waited patiently for evening milking. She's all I got left, Thomas said, running his hand along Bess's flank. Lost 5 head to disease last winter, sold 4 more to pay the bank. But Bess here, she's been with this family for 8 years. She remembers better times. Maya stood back, watching as Thomas settled onto the milking stool and began the rhythmic work. The cow stood quiet, her breath making small clouds in the cooling air. The sound of milk hitting the pail was like rain on a tin roof, steady and comforting. Want to try? Thomas asked. Maya shook her head and stepped further back. It's all right, he said gently. Animals know when someone's afraid, but they also know when someone's kind. Bess won't hurt you. The next morning, Maya woke to the sound of Thomas chopping wood behind the house. She dressed quickly and found him splitting logs for the winter, his shirt dark with sweat despite the cool morning air. A pile of bills sat on the chopping block, weighed down with a stone. Bank wants their money by Christmas, Thomas said without looking up. If I can't pay, they'll take the ranch. Maya picked up some of the smaller pieces of wood and carried them to the stack by the kitchen door. Thomas nodded his thanks and kept working. They spent the morning in comfortable silence, him splitting wood, her carrying and stacking. When the sun grew high, she brought him a cup of water from the well. Their first weeks together passed like this. Work shared in silence. Meals eaten across a table that held too much quiet. Evenings spent by the fire with nothing but the crackle of burning wood between them. Maya learned the rhythm of ranch life. Chickens fed at dawn, eggs gathered warm from the nests. Bess milked morning and evening. She swept the house and helped with cooking, her small hands careful with dishes and gentle with the food. Thomas watched her move through his broken world like someone trying to remember how to be alive. She jumped at sudden sounds, a door slamming, a chicken squawking, the distant bellow of cattle. But slowly, day by day, she began to breathe deeper. The tight lines around her eyes started to soften. One evening, as October painted the prairie gold and red, Maya appeared in the barn while Thomas was milking Bess. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, then walked slowly to where he sat. She held out her hands. Thomas looked at her for a moment, then stood up. You sure? Maya nodded. He guided her hands to Bess's warm flank, showed her how to position the milk pail, how to grip gentle but firm. Easy now, he said softly. She's been doing this longer than both of us been alive. Maya's first attempts produced nothing but frustrated sighs from the cow. But Thomas was patient, his big hands covering hers, showing her the rhythm. On her 4th try, a thin stream of milk hit the pail. Maya looked up at Thomas with something that might have been surprise, might have been pride. It was the first real expression he had seen on her face since the day they met. Good girl, he said quietly. Both of you. From that night on, milking became Maya's job. She would sit on the low stool, her head pressed against Bess's warm side, and work in steady silence while Thomas tended the other animals. The cow seemed to understand that these small hands needed patience, and she stood still as stone while Maya learned. The creditors came on a cold morning in November, 3 men in dark suits who looked out of place against the prairie sky. Maya was feeding the chickens when she saw them riding up the road. She dropped the corn and ran to the house, her heart beating like a trapped bird. Thomas met the men at the gate, his face calm, but his hands clenched at his sides. Maya watched from the kitchen window as they talked. Papers passed back and forth, voices raised. When the men finally rode away, Thomas stood alone in the yard for a long time, staring at the ground. That night at supper, he was quieter than usual. Maya set a bowl of stew before him and noticed his hands shaking slightly as he picked up a spoon. "They want the ranch," he said finally. "Give me until after Christmas, then they'll take everything." He looked across the table at Maya. "I'm sorry. I know you just got settled here, but—" Maya stood up from her chair and walked around the table. She stopped beside Thomas and, for the first time since she had known him, reached out and touched his shoulder. Her small hand rested there for just a moment, but it was enough. Thomas looked up at her, and she saw tears in his pale blue eyes. "I won't let them take you back to Morrison's," he said. "I'll find somewhere safe for you to go. Someone good to take care of you." Maya shook her head firmly. She pointed to herself, then to him, then to the house around them. "You want to stay?" Thomas asked. Maya nodded. "Even if we lose everything." She nodded again, and this time she almost smiled. Thomas reached up and covered her small hand with his own. "Then we'll figure something out," he said. "We'll find a way." Outside, the first winter storm was building on the horizon, dark clouds gathering like the troubles that circled their small, fragile world. But inside the warm kitchen, with Maya's hand on his shoulder and Bess lowing softly in the barn, Thomas felt something he had not felt in 2 years. Hope taking root in ground he had thought was too broken to grow anything at all. The storm would come, and with it choices that would test everything they were building together. But tonight, there was soup still warm in their bowls and a silence between them that no longer felt empty. The dust cloud appeared on the horizon like a bad dream taking shape. Thomas saw it first from the porch of Henley's store, where he'd been teaching Maya to count coins with patient fingers. The girl had been making progress, small sounds, half words that came easier now, like water finding its way through cracked earth. But when she saw that dust, rising like smoke from the devil's own fire, every sound died in her throat. Thomas felt the change in her before he understood it himself. Her small hand went cold in his, and her breathing turned shallow and quick. The coins scattered from her fingers, rolling across the wooden boards with tiny metal voices that seemed too loud in the sudden stillness. "Maya!" He turned to look at her face and saw something that made his old heart skip. Her eyes had gone wide and empty, staring at that distant cloud like she was seeing ghosts ride out of it. 3 riders. Thomas could make out their shapes now, black against the pale sky. They rode with the easy confidence of men who owned whatever ground their horses touched. Even from this distance, there was something wrong about them, something that made the hair on Thomas's neck stand up like a dog sensing wolves. Maya's breathing turned to short, sharp gasps. Then, without warning, she began to scream. It wasn't the cry of a hurt child or the wail of someone having a nightmare. This was something deeper and more terrible, a sound torn from a place where fear lived like a living thing. It cut through the afternoon air like a blade, sending chickens scattering and making horses stamp nervously in their stalls. Thomas had never heard her make a sound louder than a whisper. Now she screamed like the world was ending all over again. "Easy, child. Easy now." He tried to gather her in his arms, but she fought him with strength he didn't know she had. Her small fists beat against his chest while that terrible sound poured out of her. People began emerging from buildings along the main street. Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house, Doc Miller wiping his hands on a bloody apron, Jim Henley himself stepping out with a shotgun already in his grip. They all heard what Thomas heard in Maya's screams. Recognition. The riders were closer now, close enough to see the way they sat their horses like kings surveying their kingdom, close enough to see the flash of silver on their gun belts and the cruel set of their mouths, close enough to see the leader's face beneath his wide-brimmed hat, a face that looked like it had been carved from stone and painted with shadows. Maya's screams turned to broken words, the first real sentences Thomas had heard from her lips. "No, no, no. Please no, they came back, please don't let them." Her voice cracked and failed, but Thomas understood. These were the men. The ones who had left her world in ashes and her family in unmarked graves. The ones who had ridden away thinking they'd killed everyone who could name them. They'd been wrong about that. The lead rider reined in his horse at the edge of town. He was a big man with pale eyes and a beard that couldn't hide the meanness in his face. When he smiled, it was like watching a snake decide whether to strike. Well, his voice carried easily in the still air. Looks like we missed one. Thomas felt Maya go rigid against him. Her screaming stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving only the sound of wind through the wooden buildings and the soft jingle of spurs as the three men dismounted. Funny thing, the leader continued, walking forward with his thumbs hooked in his gun belt. We heard tell there was a little Mexican girl in this town. One who might have seen things she shouldn't have seen. One who might remember faces she shouldn't remember. Thomas stood slowly, keeping Maya behind him. His old Colt felt heavy at his hip, heavier than it had in years. Around them, the townspeople watched from doorways and windows, but none stepped forward. This wasn't their fight, and everyone knew it. Don't know what you're talking about, friend, Thomas said quietly. The man's smile widened. Oh, I think you do. See, we had some business down south a few months back. Cleaned out a little settlement that was harboring some troublemakers. Thought we got them all, but... He tilted his head, looking past Thomas to where Maya pressed herself against the porch railing. Seems like we were careless. Maya whimpered, a sound so small and broken that it cut Thomas deeper than any bullet could have. She was shaking now, shaking like a leaf in a storm, and he could feel her terror like heat rising from fire. The girl don't remember nothing, Thomas said. She ain't spoke a word since she got here. That's so. The man took another step forward. His companions flanked him, hands resting easy on their weapons. Well, maybe she just needs the right encouragement to find her voice. We're real good at helping folks remember things. That's when Thomas understood. It didn't matter what Maya remembered or didn't remember. It didn't matter that she'd been silent as stone for months. These men had come to finish what they'd started, and they wouldn't leave any loose ends breathing. He thought about running. Thought about grabbing Maya and heading for the back door, trying to reach his horse, maybe getting enough of a head start to make it to the next town. But his legs were old and stiff, and their horses were young and fast. They'd be run down before they made a mile. Behind him, Maya's small hand clutched at his shirt. She was trying to make herself invisible, trying to disappear into his shadow like she had that first night when she'd hidden under his porch. But there was no hiding from this. No running from what was coming. The leader's hand dropped to his gun. Here's how this is going to work, old man. You're going to step aside, nice and peaceful, and we're going to take care of our business. Do that, and you can go back to whatever it is old men do around here. Fight us, and you'll die right alongside her. Thomas felt something shift inside his chest. Maybe it was fear finally finding its voice, or maybe it was something else, something that had been sleeping for a long time and was just now waking up. He thought about Maya's small hand in his, teaching her to count coins and read simple words. He thought about the way she'd started to smile sometimes when she thought he wasn't looking. He thought about how she'd curled up next to him during thunderstorms, trusting him to keep her safe. He thought about what it meant to be family. Can't do that, he said simply. The leader's eyes went cold. That's a shame, old-timer. That's a real shame. Thomas's hand moved to his gun, and he knew with perfect clarity that he was about to die. His draw had been fast once, 20 years ago, when his hands were steady and his eyes were sharp. But time had taken the speed from his fingers and the sureness from his aim. It didn't matter. Some things were worth dying for. Behind him, Maya whispered something so soft he almost didn't hear it. But when the words reached his ears, they filled him with a strange, fierce joy. She called him Papa, and as his hand closed on the grip of his Colt, Thomas smiled. In that moment, with death walking toward them on dusty boots, an old man and a broken child discovered that love could bloom even in the hardest ground, and that some flowers were beautiful enough to die protecting. The blood had long since soaked into the dust of Main Street, but Thomas could still see the stains when he closed his eyes. 3 men had ridden into town that day. Only one had ridden out, and even he carried lead in his shoulder and fear in his eyes that would follow him to his grave. Thomas touched the bandage on his left arm where Doc Miller had dug out the bullet. It ached when the weather changed, but he was alive. More than alive. He had discovered something in those terrible moments when death walked close. He had learned what it meant to fight for family. Maya sat beside him on the porch steps, her small fingers tracing patterns in the wood grain. 3 weeks had passed since the gunfight, and the town had settled back into its quiet rhythms. But something had changed between them, something deeper than words or fear or the simple need for survival. She spoke now. Not much, and not often, but real words that came from her heart instead of empty sounds. Papa, she had called him that day, and the word had given him strength to draw his gun faster than he had in 20 years. Fast enough to matter. Fast enough to live. The garden needs planting, he said quietly, watching the way afternoon light caught in her dark hair. Spring's here proper now. Maya looked up at him with those eyes that had seen too much but were learning to see beauty again. Can we plant flowers? Her voice was still soft, still careful, like she was testing whether the world would punish her for making sound. But there was something new in it, a small flame of hope that grew brighter each day. Flowers, vegetables, whatever you want, Thomas said. Got enough seed to feed half the county if they take root. They walked together to the patch of earth behind his cabin, where winter frost had finally released its grip on the soil. The ground looked dead and hard, like nothing good could ever grow there. But Thomas had lived long enough to know that the earth was patient. It would wait through the longest winter for the chance to bloom again. Maya knelt and pressed her palm to the dirt. It's cold, she said. Ground's out to be cold before it can warm up proper, Thomas told her. That's how growing works. You got to start in the dark and work your way toward the light. He thought about his own words as he fetched the tools from the shed. How long had he been buried in his own winter? How many years had he spent frozen in the memory of things lost, afraid to plant anything new because it might die? Maya picked up a small hand spade and began turning the soil with careful determination. She worked in silence for a while, but it wasn't the empty quiet of fear anymore. This was the peaceful silence of someone comfortable in their own skin, content to let their hands speak instead of their voice. Tell me about the flowers, she said eventually. Thomas settled beside her with the packet of wildflower seeds Mrs. Patterson had given him. The paper was worn soft from handling, and he could feel the tiny promises of life rattling inside. Well, he said, reading the faded writing on the packet. Says here we got Indian paintbrush, bluebonnets, black-eyed Susans, and evening primrose. All native flowers. Ones that know how to survive in hard country. Like us, Maya said quietly. The words hit him like a gentle punch to the chest. Like us. 2 survivors learning to trust the world again. 2 hearts that have been broken but not destroyed, finding their way back to something that might be called happiness. They worked through the afternoon, turning soil and mixing in the compost Thomas had been saving. Maya's hands grew dirty, but she didn't seem to mind. She hummed sometimes while she worked, little scraps of melody that she probably didn't realize she was making. The sound filled the empty spaces in Thomas's chest. Papa, she said as they scattered the first seeds, do you think my mama would like the flowers? Thomas paused, a handful of seeds warm in his palm. Maya rarely spoke of her family, and when she did, it was usually in whispers, as if saying their names too loud might bring back the men who had taken them away. I think she'd love them, he said carefully. I think she'd be proud to see you making something beautiful grow. Maya nodded and scattered her own handful of seeds with serious concentration. I dreamed about her last night. She wasn't sad anymore. They planted vegetables next, tomatoes, beans, squash, and corn. Thomas showed Maya how to make neat rows and how to judge the right spacing between plants. She caught on quickly, her small hands surprisingly sure as she pressed seeds into the earth. Why did you stay? She asked as they worked on the bean row. What do you mean? When those men came. Why didn't you run away? Thomas considered the question while he measured space for the next seed. It was a fair thing to ask. He could have walked away. Should have, maybe. An old man with sense would have stepped aside and let the past settle its own debts. Because you were mine to protect, he said finally. Family don't run from family. Maya stopped working and looked at him with those dark eyes that held more wisdom than any child should carry. Am I really your family? Real as blood, Thomas said. Maybe more real, because we chose each other. She smiled then, the first full, unguarded smile he'd seen from her. It was like watching the sun come up after the longest night of winter. They finished planting as the day began to fade toward evening. The garden looked like nothing much, just turned earth and the promise of something better. But Thomas could picture how it would look in a few months. Green rows of vegetables, splashes of wildflower color, the busy hum of bees, and the rustle of leaves in the wind. Maya helped him carry the tools back to the shed. Her clothes were dirty and her hair had escaped from its braid, but she looked more alive than he'd ever seen her. Like she'd remembered how to be a child again. Will you teach me to read better? She asked as they walked back toward the cabin. Of course I will. What do you want to read? Everything, she said with the kind of fierce hunger that only children possess. I want to read everything in the world. Thomas laughed, a sound that surprised them both. When was the last time he'd laughed? When had joy become such a stranger to his life? That's a tall order, he said. But we got time. All the time in the world. That night, Maya fell asleep curled against his side while he read to her from an old book of fairy tales. Her breathing was deep and peaceful, the sleep of someone who felt safe. Thomas sat awake long after she drifted off, thinking about seeds and seasons and the strange miracle of second chances. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain, the kind of gentle spring shower that would help their newly planted seeds find their way toward the light. In the space between one breath and the next, Thomas understood that healing wasn't something you waited for. It was something you chose again and again, until choosing hope became as natural as breathing.